August 14, 1871. A massive stone wall rises 11 meters into the African sky. No mortar, no cement. Just stone on stone fitted so precisely, you cannot slide a knife blade between them. The wall curves and bends like a living thing stretching for 250 meters. At the base, a young Shona man named Tende places his hand on granite his great-grandfather cut. His fingers trace patterns carved by ancestors who understood geometry the world would not teach in European universities for another 300 years. A white explorer stands behind him, notebook open, and says the words that will echo through history. Africans could never have built this. It must have been Phoenicians, or Arabs, or a lost white tribe. Anyone but the black hands that shaped every stone. What happened next is the greatest architectural theft in human history, and you were never taught a single word of it. They told you Africa was huts and tribes. They showed you images of poverty and chaos. They never mentioned the stone cities, the gold trade routes, the universities, the empires that made European kings jealous. Great Zimbabwe stood for 500 years as proof that everything you learned about Africa was a lie. So they erased it. They gave credit to imaginary white builders. They stole the story and buried the truth under layers of colonial propaganda, so thick that even today, most people have no idea black Africans built monuments that rival anything in Europe. This is not ancient history. This is your history. And after this video, you will never see the wealth gap, the lies in textbooks, or the systematic erasure of black achievement the same way again. By the end of this video, you will know exactly who built Great Zimbabwe and how they engineered stone architecture so advanced it still stands 800 years later. You will know the names of the kings who controlled gold routes that fed European treasuries. You will know how white colonizers deliberately created the myth of mysterious white builders to justify stealing an entire country. And you will know why this same pattern of building black wealth and then destroying it happened in Tulsa, in Rosewood, in Wilmington, over and over again. You will understand that your poverty is not your fault. It was stolen. Your history was not absent. It was erased. Your ancestors were not primitive. They were geniuses. And the same people who burned Black Wall Street are the descendants of the people who lied about who built Great Zimbabwe. This connects to everything happening right now. The wealth gap, reparations, why they fight so hard to keep certain history out of schools. Because if you knew what your ancestors built, if you knew what was stolen, if you knew the truth, you would demand what is owed. And that terrifies them. So let's go back to the beginning. Back to the stone walls. Back to the kingdom they tried to erase. Back to Great Zimbabwe, 1100 years ago, while Europe was crawling out of the Dark Ages, while Vikings were raiding coastal villages, while feudal lords were building wooden castles that would rot away in a century. Black Africans in Southeast Africa were constructing something that would last forever. Great Zimbabwe. The name means house of stone in the Shona language. And it was not a village. It was not a collection of huts. It was a sophisticated urban center that housed up to 18,000 people at its peak. 18,000 people. Think about that number. In the year 1300 that made Great Zimbabwe larger than London, larger than most European cities. This was a metropolis with complex social hierarchies, specialized labor forces, international trade networks, and architectural innovation that would not appear in Europe for centuries. The kingdom controlled the land between the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers. Rich land, gold land. The Shona people who built Great Zimbabwe were not primitive tribesmen scraping by in the wilderness. They were master miners who extracted gold from dozens of mines across the region. They were skilled metallurgists who refined that gold, using furnaces that reached temperatures European blacksmiths could not match. They were long-distance traders whose goods reached the markets of Kilwa on the Swahili coast, then sailed to Arabia, Persia, India, and even China. Archaeologists have found Chinese porcelain at Great Zimbabwe. Ming Dynasty ceramics dated to the 14th and 15th centuries, glass beads from Syria, shells from the Indian Ocean. This was not an isolated African village. This was an economic powerhouse connected to the medieval global economy. And at the center of it all stood the stone walls. 3 main areas. The hill complex perched on a granite outcrop overlooking the valley, the great enclosure below with its massive outer wall, and the valley ruins spreading between them. Together they formed a city unlike anything else in sub-Saharan Africa. A city built to last, a city built to impress, a city built by black hands that white historians would spend 400 years trying to credit to anyone else. Let's talk about the architecture, because this is where the genius becomes undeniable. The walls of Great Zimbabwe were built using a technique called dry stone construction. No mortar, no cement, no binding agent of any kind. Just granite blocks cut from the surrounding hills, shaped to fit and stacked with such precision that the walls have stood for 8 centuries through rain, wind, earthquakes, and the weight of their own mass. The great enclosure has an outer wall that is 11 meters high in places and 5 meters thick at the base. That wall contains approximately 15,000 tons of stone. 15,000 tons placed by hand, without cranes, without pulleys, without any of the machinery Europeans would claim was necessary for such construction. The Shona builders understood load distribution, understood how to taper walls for stability, understood how to create drainage systems to prevent water damage. Inside the great enclosure stands the conical tower, 10 meters tall, perfectly round, tapering to a point. Solid stone all the way through. No one knows exactly what it symbolized. Some archaeologists think it represented a grain bin, a symbol of plenty. Others believe it had ritual significance. But everyone agrees it is a masterpiece of engineering. The stones are laid in precise horizontal courses that create a smooth surface. The entire structure required mathematical calculations that most medieval European masons could not perform. And here is the thing that should make you furious. The builders left their signatures everywhere. The stonework is distinctly Shona. The construction techniques match other Shona sites across the region. The pottery found throughout the ruins is Shona. The tools are Shona. The oral histories of the Shona people describe the kingdom and its rulers. The DNA evidence from burials is indigenous African. Every single piece of evidence points to one undeniable truth. Black Africans built Great Zimbabwe. No one else. No mysterious white tribe. No Phoenician sailors. No Arab traders. The Shona people designed it, engineered it, constructed it, lived in it, governed from it, and created a civilization that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. But that truth was too dangerous to acknowledge. Because if black Africans could build cities of stone, if they could create sophisticated trade networks, if they could govern complex societies, then every justification for slavery collapsed. Every claim of white superiority became a lie. Every excuse for colonization evaporated. So they buried the truth. And they did it systematically. Pause and reflect for a moment. While European children learned that their ancestors built great cathedrals and castles, African children were taught their ancestors lived in mud huts and had no history. While white students studied Greek democracy and Roman engineering, black students were told Africa contributed nothing to human civilization. The erasure was so complete, so total, that millions of people today still believe Africa was primitive before Europeans arrived. That lie starts at Great Zimbabwe, and that lie was deliberate. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe reached its peak between 1200 and 1450. During that time, it controlled the gold trade across southeastern Africa. Shona merchants transported gold from the mines to the trading posts on the coast. From there, Swahili and Arab traders carried it across the Indian Ocean. That gold ended up in the treasuries of sultans and emperors. It decorated mosques in Cairo and palaces in Persia. It was melted down and minted into coins that fueled medieval economies across 3 continents. The kingdom was ruled by a Mambo, a Shona king. Oral traditions preserve the names of several rulers, though we do not have complete records. What we know is that the Mambo controlled both secular and religious authority. He lived in the hill complex, the most defensible position overlooking his city. From there, he governed a hierarchy of officials, priests, warriors, merchants, and artisans. Let me introduce you to one of these builders. Not a specific historical figure, because the colonizers made sure those names were not recorded, but a composite, a representation of the thousands of Shona men and women who made Great Zimbabwe possible. His name is Tendai. Born around the year 1300 in a village near the growing city. His father was a stone mason who learned the craft from his father. The knowledge passed down through generations: which stones were strongest, how to read the grain, how to split granite along its natural lines, how to shape blocks so they fit without mortar, how to build walls that would stand for centuries. Tendai grew up watching his father work. At age 7, he began carrying water to the construction sites. At 10, he was mixing the mud used to create temporary forms. At 12, he learned to use the iron tools that cut and shaped the granite. By 15, he could read a stone like his father, seeing where it wanted to break, understanding its strength and weakness. The work was brutal, quarrying granite under the African sun, hauling blocks that weighed hundreds of kilograms, fitting them precisely into walls that could not tolerate error. One misplaced stone could cause a collapse. One miscalculation could kill workers. The builders carried that weight every day. But Tendai was part of something larger than himself. He was building the House of Stone. He was creating a monument that would announce to the world that the Shona people had arrived, that they were powerful, that they were sophisticated, that they were here to stay. By the time Tendai was 30, he was a master mason leading his own crew. He worked on the great enclosure, helping to build the massive outer wall. He calculated the taper needed for stability. He supervised the placement of thousands of blocks. He created patterns in the stone decorative chevrons near the top that demonstrated skill and artistry. When the wall was complete, when it rose 11 meters into the sky, when it enclosed a space larger than a dozen European castles, Tendai stood back and saw what he had built. A monument that would outlast empires, a structure that would speak his people's greatness to generations unborn. He could not have known that 500 years later, white men would stand where he stood and declare that people like him could never have built what he built. He could not have imagined that his genius would be stolen and attributed to imaginary white builders. He could not have foreseen that his descendants would be taught in colonial schools that their ancestors were primitive savages, incapable of architectural achievement. But that is exactly what happened. And it happened because Great Zimbabwe was too impressive to ignore and too dangerous to acknowledge. The kingdom thrived for 2.5 centuries. Trade made the ruling class wealthy. Gold and ivory flowed out. Glass beads, ceramics, and cloth flowed in. The population grew. More stone buildings were constructed. Great Zimbabwe became the capital of an empire that stretched across the plateau. But empires rise and empires fall. By 1450, Great Zimbabwe was in decline. Historians debate why. Some say the gold mines were exhausted. Some say overpopulation strained resources. Some say trade routes shifted. What we know is that the city was gradually abandoned. The Shona people moved to new centers of power. The kingdom fragmented into smaller states, but the stones remained. The walls still stood. And when the first Portuguese explorers reached the interior in the 16th century, they found the ruins and were astonished. Portuguese records from the 1500s describe the stone structures with wonder. They note the sophistication. They recognize that this was built by people who understood engineering and architecture. But here is where the poison begins. The Portuguese could not reconcile advanced architecture with black Africans. So they began to speculate. Maybe Arabs built it. Maybe it was the legendary kingdom of the Queen of Sheba. Maybe it was related to King Solomon's mines, mentioned in the Bible. The speculation was not innocent. It was ideological. Because Portugal was deep in the slave trade by this time. They were capturing Africans and shipping them to Brazil by the thousands. And they needed to believe that Africans were inferior. They needed to believe that black people had no civilization, no history, no capability beyond manual labor. Great Zimbabwe threatened that belief. So they began to construct an alternative explanation. For 300 years, Great Zimbabwe sat in the interior of Africa, largely unknown to the wider world. Local Shona people knew the stories. They told their children about the kingdom that once ruled there. But colonial powers were focused on the coasts, on trade, on extraction. The interior remained African territory. That changed in the 19th century. European powers began to carve up Africa. They wanted land resources and control, and they needed justifications for taking what did not belong to them. Great Zimbabwe became a tool in that justification. In 1871, a German explorer named Karl Mauch reached the ruins. He was not the first European to see them, but he was the first to publicize them widely. And what he wrote would shape the narrative for the next 100 years. Mauch stood in front of the stone walls and made a decision. He decided that Africans could not have built this. He decided that it must have been the work of a foreign civilization. He looked at the stonework and convinced himself he saw Phoenician or Arab influence. He looked at the conical tower and decided it was a copy of a building from Solomon's temple. He wrote in his journals that Great Zimbabwe was proof of a lost white civilization in Africa. Pause here and feel the weight of what happened. A white man stood in front of proof of black genius and could not accept what he saw. He could not believe that the black people living around the ruins were the descendants of the builders. So he invented a fantasy. He created mythical white architects to satisfy his own prejudice. And then he published that fantasy as fact. Mauch's reports reached Europe and caused a sensation. Newspapers printed stories about mysterious ruins in Africa, built by ancient white races. Explorers and fortune hunters flooded into the region looking for treasure. The British South Africa Company, controlled by Cecil Rhodes, used the ruins as propaganda. They claimed they were reclaiming land that once belonged to a lost white civilization. Think about the audacity. Think about the evil of that lie. Black Africans build a stone city. White colonizers arrive centuries later. They cannot accept that black people built it, so they invent white builders. Then they use that invented story to justify stealing the land. They literally stole the past to justify stealing the present. And it worked. The British colonized the region and named it Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes. They established white minority rule. They passed laws that took land from the Shona people and gave it to white settlers. They created a system where black people were forced to work in mines and farms for low wages, while white people accumulated wealth. And they taught in schools that Great Zimbabwe was built by mysterious foreigners, not by the black Africans whose land had just been stolen. The propaganda was relentless. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, white archaeologists excavated Great Zimbabwe. But they did not excavate to learn. They excavated to confirm their prejudice. They searched desperately for any artifact that could support the theory of non-African builders. They found Chinese ceramics and Middle Eastern glass beads and declared that proved foreign construction. They ignored the obvious explanation that Great Zimbabwe was a trading hub that imported luxury goods. When local Shona people told them that their ancestors built the city, the white archaeologists dismissed them as ignorant natives telling folk tales. When oral histories preserved the names of kings and described the kingdom, white scholars said oral traditions were unreliable. When the architecture clearly matched other Shona building styles, they claimed it was coincidence. The most important excavation happened in 1929. A British archaeologist named Gertrude Carton Thompson was hired to settle the question once and for all. She was a serious scholar, trained in scientific methods. She spent months at Great Zimbabwe, carefully excavating, documenting, analyzing. And when she published her findings, they were unambiguous. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people. The evidence was overwhelming. The pottery was local. The tools were local. The construction techniques matched other indigenous sites. There was no evidence whatsoever of foreign builders. None. The whole theory was a fantasy created by white supremacy. Carton Thompson presented her findings at a conference in South Africa in 1929. She stood in front of an audience of white scholars and government officials and told them the truth. Black Africans built Great Zimbabwe, and you know what happened? They rejected her findings. They attacked her methodology. They continued teaching the old lies. Because accepting the truth meant accepting that Black Africans were capable of sophisticated civilization. And that truth threatened the entire colonial project. The Rhodesian government actively suppressed information about Great Zimbabwe for decades. They did not want Black Africans to know their ancestors built stone cities. They did not want Black Africans to have pride in their heritage. They wanted to maintain the fiction that white rule was necessary, because Black people were incapable of self-governance. In schools across Rhodesia, Black children learned that Great Zimbabwe was mysterious ruins, possibly built by ancient traders from the Middle East. They learned their ancestors lived in simple villages and had no significant history. They learned that civilization came to Africa with Europeans. The erasure was systematic and deliberate. This is not ancient history. Rhodesia existed until 1980. That was 45 years ago. There are people watching this video right now who grew up under that system, who were taught those lies in school, who internalized the message that their ancestors had no history worth learning. And here is what makes it even worse. The lies did not stay in Africa. They spread worldwide. Textbooks in America and Europe taught that Africa had no significant civilizations before European contact. Museums displayed artifacts from Great Zimbabwe, but labeled them as mysterious or attributed them to outside influences. The narrative of African primitiveness became so entrenched that even many African Americans today do not know their ancestors built stone cities that rivaled medieval Europe. Your history was stolen twice. First, when the cities were abandoned or destroyed. Then, when the memory of those cities was erased and replaced with lies. And that double theft is why you were never taught about Great Zimbabwe in school. That is why the story of African achievement was buried. Because knowledge is power, and they could not allow you to know how powerful your ancestors truly were. But here is the thing they could not erase. The stones are still there. Great Zimbabwe still stands. 800 years later, the walls still rise 11 meters into the African sky. The conical tower still points toward heaven. The ruins still spread across 72 hectares of land, and every stone in those walls is a testament to Black genius that no amount of propaganda can destroy. In 1986, UNESCO declared Great Zimbabwe a World Heritage Site. The description acknowledges that it was built by the ancestors of the Shona people. The scientific consensus is unanimous. The debate is over, Black Africans built Great Zimbabwe, case closed, but the damage was already done. Generations grew up without this knowledge. The wealth that should have compounded through those generations was stolen. The pride that comes from knowing your ancestors built empires was replaced with shame, and the systems that benefited from that theft are still in place today. And this brings us to the pattern. Because Great Zimbabwe is not unique, it is not an isolated case of white people lying about black achievement and then using those lies to justify theft. This is the playbook. This is the pattern repeated over and over again across centuries and continents. Let me show you 4 more examples. 4 more times, the exact same thing happened. And when you see the pattern, you will understand this was not accident. This was policy. This was war. This was systematic destruction of black wealth and systematic erasure of black history, and it connects directly to why you struggle today.